Ladies and gentlemen, we are a little bit pressed for time because obviously we lost a bit of time back there. So my esteemed panelists here, I think perhaps we're going to make 3 or 4 minute little sort of presentations. I'm going to unilaterally declare, panel, that we don't really have time for that. So I'm going to ask you questions, and then I want to leave a little bit of time for the audience to ask you questions too. I hope that's okay with you guys. So without further ado, as we are talking about the fragility of both worldwide water supplies and the increasing sort of soil quality problems that the world faces. We heard about it in Brazil. We heard the commissioner talk about 60 or 70% of soil inside the EU being not healthy, or at one point he called it sick. It seems to me these are twin problems, but if I can start with you, Andrea, which do you think is more pressing, more serious, or is it silly to try and divide them up that way?
Of course it's silly.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, we'll go from there. So thank you for the opportunity. First of all, I think it's lovely to have a conversation about water at an agricultural community setting, which seems also silly, but it's often left out of the conversation. So freshwater biodiversity is crashing as well as everything else, 83% decline in what is available in freshwater populations. That's in large measure because of agricultural use of water or pollution in water. There's a larger story that I think, though, we want to bring to the table, which is the global water cycle is changing, and we hear that, the droughts, the floods, the things that aren't happening the way they used to. Part of that is the climate. Part of it is the loss of habitat. And so we have things that are happening together, which is really why it's so hard. So evapotranspiration coming from trees is as important to our precipitation as where it's coming from oceans and sort of the traditional cycle. So it becomes really important to put those things together. It's in our interest, if we're going to work on resilience, drought resilience, to also invest in natural areas. But on farm practices and local watershed practices, it's really critical to look at the health of the watershed, meaning the soil health and what's happening, what's hitting your watersheds. So I think you have to put it together, and I'll give you a little quick example, maybe just to bring to life how you can pull together a lot of these pieces into some practical applications. So some of you may have heard of the New York watershed investment in the Catskills. New York City was able to avoid an $8 billion investment in filtration plant. Instead, they were able to invest in the Catskills and the farming community there, $2.5 billion. So, quite a lot less money was invested, and it went to the farming community. The investments.
How did that work?
So they went under contract with farmers and said instead, this is like an ounce of prevention, pound of cure problem. So sediment and nutrient loading coming to New York City water was coming from the Catskills, where most of the water comes from. And so they could invest in practice change there with farmers, dairy farmers, also forest owners, second home owners that were developing to prevent the change in the water quality coming into New York City. City of New York was very happy to do that, because that was a lot less money. We have, though, other examples around the world that work very much the same, and very quickly a case from Nairobi, the Upper Tana watershed, where again we've looked at the bigger picture of what's happening in the watershed, finding that there are allies between the agricultural community up watershed, very steep slopes in the Upper Tana watershed, and downstream major bulk water users, the reservoirs for hydropower, the city of Nairobi. And based on a business case, an understanding of what was needed, we can invest in that upper watershed to improve soil health, put in contouring and terracing, riparian buffer strips. And that transition for the farmers was paid for by the downstream bulk water users, and they're quite happy to do it because now they are solving a problem that they have in terms of sediment loading and nutrient loading downstream. So when we separate problems, we find sometimes solutions don't add up. But if you can bring together sometimes problems and see it in a larger context, it is in our interest to invest together and we find mutual beneficial relationships. So that's why I think it's silly to split those things up.
I was not offended to be called silly. I saluted your wisdom in seeing me as I am. Truke, you work for Cargill. Now, forgive me, I associate Cargill with a sort of worldwide seeds business. I'm sure your agribusiness has many more elements to it than that. But when it comes to water, and am I right in saying you were at this UN Water Summit the other day? Were you there?
I was, yes.
Right, so tell me what Cargill is doing to address the global water crisis.
Well, it starts with what we do as Cargill. And as Cargill, we are a connector in the value chain. So we connect the farmers, the rangers, the growers with our customers, which represent the brands that you see every day in your grocery store or the ingredients that you eat in your restaurants. And it's really that connector role that's essential in what we're doing around water. So when you look at water, it's like quite often when we think about water, we actually don't think about water. We only think about water when it becomes a crisis, and then we go into crisis mode. And that's where the real opportunity is, because we have to shift from moving to crisis mode towards how do we build water resiliency, the need to adapt to climate change into our programs. So at Cargill, we're looking at that connector role and say, how can we enable farmers and growers and ranchers with incentives to implement regenerative agriculture, which we're doing in North America alone already with more than 500,000 acres enrolled in our programs. But also, how do we enable technology and access to data to the growers, like we're doing in Mexico, where we are creating financing solutions that allows these farmers to have access to much more efficient drip irrigation technology that helps them save 50% of the water use, but also helps them increase their yields, helps them be less dependent on in the struggle to find labor to address the land. And it's these solutions that come together. And underlying or overarching all of that, there are commitments, but much more important is the impact that we're driving on the ground and how we connect these farmers with our downstream customers to help share the risk that these individual farmers are taking every day and tap into that local knowledge that these farmers have, because they locally know their solutions. When we talk about regenerative agriculture, it's not like one definition, one solution. It's really tapping into what is most relevant in your local context and help them with incentives that work for them, help them choose what works for them, but then also allow it to scale and allow it to translate into value that's recognized by the larger brands that buy from us.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Mark, we focused quite a lot of this conversation on water so far. You, I know, I mean, obviously you speak as Syngenta person, but you also speak as a farmer in the UK, and you were telling me a little bit about your farm earlier. Bottom line, though, we know soil quality is a huge problem across the world. And we know that companies like Syngenta, and I'm not sort of saying this simply because we've just had a bunch of protesters on accusing Syngenta of greenwashing, but Syngenta's business is all about applying chemicals to the land. And so I'm just wondering how you, as a custodian of a farm, can square that with your corporate life, working for a company that wants to persuade farmers and society as a whole that it is still a very good idea to pour chemicals into the soil.
Yeah, look, I am a regenerative farmer. In fact, my wife and I established a new farming business only 3 years ago, next door to a family farming business in the UK. We're now building the business with 320 hectares. We manage that on a completely no-till basis. We've fully established it with the right machinery to do no-till. We're using variable rate technology. We love the sort of technology that Ranveen was talking about, and we want to do more of that. And we are trying to keep the roots in our soil living all the way through the season, so we are improving the soil health. And gradually, we are already starting to see some benefits of doing some reduced input work. We've now eliminated phosphate and potash fertilizers, for example, and are using municipal waste, turning that into compost and putting that back onto the soil.
So in short, you're weaning yourself off fertilizers and pesticides.
We are starting to understand
I mean,
more.
Syngenta will be thrilled about that.
We are starting to understand more about where we can use our inputs effectively to harness the power of nature to provide for the crop, and where we need to supplement that and where we need to control things in order to get to a productive quality crop. And ultimately, what Syngenta is trying to do is to get farmers to be able to produce productive crops sustainably. And so, yes, we are a chemical business, but we're also a seeds business, and we're trying to bring new technologies that harness the needs of sustainable farming and bring those new genetic technologies and new chemical technologies that are more tailored to a sustainable farming approach. We are also a biostimulants business. We're now and a biocontrols business, and we're investing very heavily in biocontrols and biostimulants. In fact, for sustainable farming, we've committed to put $2 billion between now and 2025 into developing sustainable farming technologies. So, and those biostimulants and biocontrols can be tailored to help soil health. For example, we've got some technologies that now improve nutrient use efficiency. So we can use less synthetic inputs and swap out the synthetic inputs and replace it with some biocontrols and biostimulants that help us to still get to productive quality food.
So if there is so much positive going on, help me understand why, for example, in this whole sort of farm-to-fork sustainable EU strategy that we're supposed to be seeing unfold right now, explain to me why it seems to be so very difficult to get everybody on board with a commitment to 50% cut in use of pesticides by the end of the decade. You know, it was something that was declared as an absolute commitment target, and now it seems there's massive pushback and it's not happening. Why?
Well, I think, you know, we are committed to the policy of what the Green Deal in farm-to-fork strategy is trying to achieve. But if you take away tools out of the toolbox from a farmer, but you don't replace it or have any understanding of how you replace it with other technologies and tools to enable him to continue to produce profitably, he's going to resist it somewhat. And we still haven't seen enough of the promotion and advocacy of technologies and how to adopt those technologies at scale. We need to give growers advice and confidence. It's been quite a risky business for me in 3 years to invest a lot of capital to set up that farming business as a regenerative operation and to take it through the transition period, which is quite a lengthy period. Just starting to see yield improvements, definitely seen cost reductions on my farm, but starting to now see some benefits in soil health from doing this. But I've got to go through that transition period. It's risky, and I don't fully understand because there isn't all of the science there yet behind all of those aspects.
That's very interesting, the way you put all of that. Andrea, you're sort of nodding sagely, but do you think there is a danger of some of this debate about the absolute need to prioritize more sustainable water use and in particular, you know, more nurturing of soil quality? Is there a danger of leaving the farmer behind?
Well, we can't. In the end, we have to figure out if it's not going to be profitable for the farmer, it's really not going to work long term. There's a transition, and the way of getting through the transition in many places is really the same, as there has to be a financial support to that transition. It may come in the way of longer terms in your farm credit programs. It may come in the way of co-investment from corporations who are interested in seeing changes in their supply chain, or bulk water users, the way that I described the two cases. But there's certainly find the ways to turn that transition over to a jointly held risk. and then find on the other side, we hope, that that is a more sustainable economic model for the farmer. I don't think that we can not look at some of the other things. There are policy enablers and things that stand in the way. So regulations that prevent some of those incentives from happening might be here. I'm not an expert on Europe, so I don't know why you're having trouble here. So I'm speaking generally. And so we certainly work in many places to try to take the very good practices that are working and figure out how to scale them by making them, incentive-based programs, or remove the barriers that prevent, sort of co-investment from farmer, private sector, public sector together. And the last one is always hard because it's always very, very particular to place, is the actual practices, the actual science is contextual. It's based on place. Until you have good examples here, it's hard to know. And it's so much based on social as well. Getting to scale isn't just about numbers on a board. It's actual changes in communities connected to markets and how the community members see themselves. And we're sort of the same all over. Our process of social change, whether it's changing farmer practices or buying iPhones, we have some people that go early and innovate. We have some people that wait, and then when they go, you find that you really coalesce around a new outcome. And then there's people that will never change because it's just not in their blood. But if we focus, I think, the longer term outcome here and not about in particular practice or a particular piece of the journey, but the long-term outcome, all those things can be solved, and they have been solved other places, and I'm sure they've been solved within your communities here.
All right. Well, we are very pressed for time. I just want one quick thought from you, Tasso, because it's great we've got you on the panel, and it seems a shame not to have a chance to ask you one question. And in a sense, a lot of the discussions I've been having are about will, political will, and the culture of farming communities, the corporate culture, and the degree to which transformational change can happen, with all of those different stakeholders being on board and the different speeds of transition of thinking. Brazil's fascinating because, as you alluded to in your presentation, you've just had a major political change. It's bye-bye Bolsonaro and it's hello again to Lula. You may or may not end up being in Lula's government, but are you suggesting to us that Brazil can and will fundamentally change its policies now when it comes to things like deforestation because Lula's back in charge? And will Lula be able to come all of those vested interests that we've read about for so long, the association of big business and big farmers with Bolsonaro, the corporate and political interests coming together? Can you overcome all of that quite easily and quickly?
Well, a lot of the problem of...
is there a microphone in the chair next to you? Because otherwise we're not going to be able to hear you. Oh, you do have a mic on, actually.
Yeah, I have a mic.
Is it working? Keep talking and let's see.
Yeah, number 7. No, number 4.
Number 7. There we go.
Yeah. So, I think most of the problems related to the environment in general and sustainable management of land in general, it's technically solved. Like we know what has to be done. And so the majority of the problems are linked to political will in one hand and investment on the other hand. So find a way in which you can make this economically to work. So so I think the first one, it's pretty much not solved, but at least we change to another side. Like we used to say in Brazil, like in a summary in Brazil, for us working on this arena, we were like swimming against the tide, and then suddenly we actually have to surf the wave back. So not that surf the wave is always perfect, right? Sometimes you fall down and you have to come back and etc. But at least you're not having to kind of go against the tide. So I think that's the first part. And the second part is a more difficult one for us right now in Brazil. Like the size of the economic crisis, it's pretty big. So for all the investment, we'll have more things to do. But I think with the change on the political wheel, it will have influence on many areas, particularly on deforestation, because deforestation works like stock market. You know, like if the perception that you have, it's that, you know, nobody cares about if you're doing something illegal or not. This just continues, right? And if you change the perception, then the risk is too high. Then you start to change the way you go. So I think that we are now entering in this new phase where the perception will be set up for, you know, it's too risky. Let's try to get the benefits of doing the right things.
Right. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time, really, but if there's anybody who's got a pressing, concise question on the issues of soil, water, reforestation, anything like that, then put your hand up. Sir, I'm looking at you. We'll take two, and then I've got a hand to Rose, because otherwise we're going to be very late. But I'm going to be very strict and say you've got to be very brief. Yep, you're on.
Thank you. Well, today we had quite a change, because everybody says we need science, but everybody has his own opinion on what is science. I say Van Montague, University Ghent, Flemish Institute for Biotechnology. We, 40 years more, worked out systems for improving plants. And there was only one voice that asked it, can we have novel plants? There was no reaction. So we know, I mean, in the early days, we don't know nothing about plants. Thanks to what in the laboratories happened, now we know really what is the basic what is the molecular base of the plant grow and of the root grow. And the root grow, that's all the microorganisms in the soil. It was vaguely known, but not really well thought. Now everybody comes to all the environmental problems that have been very well documented today, but nobody dares to say, well, yes, the molecular base of all these problems, there is already a lot known thanks to the medical field, to all kind of other fundamental researchers. It is there. Europe was leading. We were the first, and at the moment we are still the largest group in the world after North Carolina for working on that.
Okay.
But in Europe, it's not always appreciated.
No.
And I think it would be wise to analyze each time where is the situation. And the situation is, like for forestry, all the areas that are destroyed, you could do reforestation. We cannot because the company Susanna, who the highest percent in the world on pulp and paper, cannot use transgenic plants that would have 30% better yield and would be adapted to the destroyed soils, where now it's arid soil. And we could, a lot of soils, with the microorganisms, we could regenerate.
Okay, well, sir, there's an interesting point, and thank you for it, but I'm going to have to stop you because we're almost out of time. There's a hand up there.
Hello. I've got the microphone.
You've got the mic, so you win. Go on.
Christopher Stopes, Organic Farmers and Growers and the Global Organic Textile Standard. Just a very quick question to Mark. If you could explain the way in which herbicides are used in no-till systems. I can understand other agrochemical inputs may be reduced, but as I understand it, you're quite reliant in a regenerative, so-called regenerative no-till farming system on the use of herbicides. It would be really helpful to have a comment from you on that. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a very practical question. So, Mark, I'm going to have to insist this is the last answer because we're really out of time. So you're looking optimistic by taking the mic, but I'm going to have to draw a close after this. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll take two. All right, you've twisted my arm. You give me your question. Mark's going to talk about herbicide use. You ask us.
I'm going to talk about trees.
Go on then.
Patrick Worms, the president of the International Union of Agroforestry, and it's obvious to me that to move to a truly regenerative agricultural system, what farmers need is not necessarily financial inducements, but technical advice. What farmers need to do is to change the way they manage their land, and that technical advice is generally not available. You are a farmer, you're not a forester, you don't know how to handle trees, yet I'm pretty certain that no matter what your farm is, you can probably make more money and have better resilience by adding hedges, windbreaks, or other forms of woody vegetation to your system. So it's a pity the commissioner has gone, because what we really need to go is to move beyond this pretty tired debate between conventional and organic and more chemistry and less chemistry, and we need to move into how we help farmers foundationally modify the management systems that they need to do to make a livelihood while maintaining the natural capital they depend on. Thank you.
Yeah, well, great point, sir. Well made. Thank you very much. Mark, it's all down to you. You're going to have to respond to both of those, and then we're going to have to close.
Actually, I'm going to respond to the latter one first. Actually, I am a bit of a forester because I have just set aside 12 hectares of my 320 hectares to plant trees. 36,000 trees we've just planted this winter, 3.6 kilometers of hedges we have just planted this winter in order to link up the biodiversity corridors on actually what is a semi-urban environment. And yes, I got government support to do that piece because that piece, it's not as economically viable as necessarily growing the crops. But I can see the long-term benefits of doing that. And I wanted to take areas of land out of production in order to do that.
How unusual are you?
Well, there's actually quite a few of us doing that.
Yeah.
And under the new eco schemes, there is an increasing number. The shift of subsidy support in the UK is moving much more to support sustainable farming under the Sustainable Farming Incentive Scheme. And so there are an encouraging amount of farmers.
Well, that's good to hear. So very briefly then, on the first question about how you, with your no-till system and your desire to, massively improve soil quality, how do you get by? How much herbicide do you use? What's your herbicide policy?
Yeah, so we still need to use herbicides right now. And 3 years into the transition, we have still got quite significant weed problems. But we have expanded the rotation. We've put more spring crops into the rotation as well as winter crops in order to increase the diversity. And we've started to use cover crops between the harvest of one crop and the planting of the spring crop. And that we've just started to see now a reduction in the really pernicious weeds like blackgrass, which is prevalent in the UK. And we're also starting to see the emergence of some technology, which we are developing in Syngenta, which helps us to identify and spot spray those weed problems that we've got, rather than using blanket applications.
Right. Well, on that note, I'm going to have to insist you stop, Mark, because we're out of time. I'm getting all sorts of messages. We had a little delay, as you know, so I'm forgiving myself for overrunning a little bit, but we've also overrun because we've had fascinating contributions and I've really enjoyed the discussion. Panel, I'm sorry I slightly shortchanged you in terms of time, but thank you so much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, please give our panel a very big thank you. Thank you all.